Welcome back to Painting with Bennett, and I hope you're doing well. As you can probably tell from whatever I end up titling this video, I'm getting into some Kill Team. I've been into this game in a pretty big way recently, and the new-ish edition of Kill Team is actually a really fun skirmish game. I know that my channel's not really like a Warhammer channel. I haven't really made any Warhammer content-related videos. Way back in the day, years ago, I played a few games of 8th edition Warhammer, as well as a couple games of the very original 2018 Kill Team, I think it was called. And anyway, I bounced off of those pretty hard. I did not think they were particularly good, but I fairly recently played the Space Marine 2 video game, and that kind of got me back into the Warhammer world in general. And then I tried a couple games of the new-ish edition of Kill Team, and it's actually just a really solid miniature skirmish game. So basically, that just means that you'll probably see some fairly regular Kill Team content from me on the channel going forward. You know, things like painting the Hivestorm box, painting a few other Kill Teams. I also have some kind of ambitious plans for battle reports and things like that. So hopefully you're somewhat interested in that, and if you aren't, that's also fine. You just don't have to watch those videos, I guess. And yeah, I know that my audience is probably more interested in general in my board game content, things like my Guards of Atlantis painting videos and my Oathsworn painting videos and stuff like that. But honestly, I just kind of prefer following whatever motivates me at the moment for my hobby painting time. And right now, that stuff is not really gripping me quite as much as playing like miniatures tabletop games. So apologies, I'll have some of that content at some point in the future going forward. But anyway, the actual meat and potatoes of this video is painting up a Vespid team. I really like how this team turned out. Originally, I wasn't really feeling inspired to come up with a original custom paint scheme for these Vespid bugs, so I just decided to mostly follow the Games Workshop box art. And then I was painting these bugs, and I was like, okay, you know, it's coming together. I dig how the reddish-orange carapaces look in and, like, you know, the bluish-white wings. And then by the end of the whole painting the team process, I was really digging how they turned out. And then I played a game with them all painted, and I was like, wow, I really like this team, and I think they are very cool. So anyway, if you want to learn a little bit about how I painted all of these orange bugs, here is the process. I primed the minis in a lightish gray color, and then sprayed a zenithal highlight of pure white. I also sprayed this white all around the gun crystals, since I want those to later be a glowing green color. I want the colors on these minis to be really bold and striking, and applying speed paints and light colors over something like a black or a dark gray zenithal shadow color would probably make things more dark and toned down than what I'm going for. That being said, I bet it would work great if you want to go for a more gritty sort of look. Then I mixed up two different speed paint colors. One was sort of like a light orangish color, and one was a little bit of a darker orangey red. The main color was 3 parts of Army Painter Sand Golem speed paint to 1 part of Nuclear Sunrise, and the sort of reddish accent color was 3 parts Slaughter Red to 1 part Fire Drake. With these colors mixed, I loaded one up on a big brush and then the second color up on a second big brush, and I wet blended these colors all over the orange carapace parts of the mini, so almost the entire mini except for the wings and the armor. I applied the accent color to spots like the carapace tips on the hand and wrist armor, or the shoulder spikes, or the edges of the wing tips, things like that, and then applied the orange everywhere else that wasn't those little accent bits, and then just really quickly jammed the brushes around to sort of smooth out the transition. I wasn't being precious with this at all. I was just sort of jamming the big brushes all around the mid-tone areas between these two colors, just trying to pull the paint in a way that it somewhat blends together. Now you do have to work pretty fast when you're doing this, because speed paints, while they dry usually slower than regular acrylic paints, they do still dry pretty fast. I worked in small sections at a time, and used the sort of joints and breaks in the carapace as natural points to sort of pause between sections. I also made custom mixes of the like reddish and orangish colors to get the exact colors I wanted, but there are lots of different speed paint colors, and if you have other suitable colors that you just want to use instead, you can obviously just do that as well. At first, I was also being really careful to avoid the armor and the wing membranes and such, but over time, I just started going faster and faster and got a little sloppier with it. And then in the future, if I need to sort of clean those areas up, I just went back over them with a light gray paint. And as always, when working with speed paints like this, don't use brushes that you really care about, because if you're using big brushes and really quickly wet blending speed paints with them, it's really easy to get paint up in the ferrule of the brush. Then I moved on to all of the gun parts and sort of Tau armor bits. I painted some parts, like the gun bits and such, this almost black color mix. But then the things like the stingers and the little claw tips, I just painted in pure black. Honestly, you probably don't really need to use two different colors of black for this. You could paint them all with just the same black color. Then I cleaned up any of the white wing or armor bits as necessary, as I mentioned before, with a very light gray or almost pure white color, just trying to roughly do a good enough color match with the color of the gray to white zenithal that's already there. But by no means does this have to be perfect, because it's all going to get covered later anyway. Then first I tried shading all of the white gun parts with a brown wash, but I didn't really like it, so I opted to go for more of a cool white color instead. I started by shading both all of the white and black parts with Army Painter Dark Blue Tone, which is this dark bluish black wash. And then I did a few scratchy thin highlights of thinned mixes of pale gray blue, white blue, and then finally pure white. In addition to using some water to thin these paints, I did also use a little bit of Pro Acryl glaze and wash medium for thinning them, since I wanted to make sure that the highlight layers don't get too chalky as white sort of tends to do. I ended up basically doing 2 highlight layers, then a final edge highlight or 2 along the way. I placed my highlights somewhat volumetrically, but I was more interested in getting interesting color gradients on each surface, rather than having the perfect light placement. Honestly, this part of shading and highlighting up the guns did take quite a while, but honestly, the white guns and armor bits are one of the main accent pieces on the minis, so I did want to devote a bit more time and effort to really making them pop. Also, for this whole white armor painting step, you could, of course, opt for something cleaner like an oil wash or a pin wash, or just be more careful with applying your shade, and focus more on like a subtractive method of painting where you shade your white down rather than highlighting it back up. But I like painting rough textures, and I feel like this adds a nice bit of storytelling about how their gear isn't in perfect condition, and it's all roughened up from use and flying through war-torn skies and not, fresh off the factory line. Anyway, then I shifted to highlighting the black parts, highlighting them first with a dark gray color, and then doing a light gray highlight that's almost sort of like a small spot highlight. The metal bits on the armor I painted with this rich gold base coat, shaded it with a thin dark brown paint 1 or 2 times, and then highlighted by mixing some silver into my gold color. Then I moved on to the wings, which are the other parts of the minis that I chose to be sort of the accent color bits. I started out applying a sort of light turquoise color speed paint and using a wet brush to feather it out towards the tips of the wings, but it looked great while it was wet, but when it dried it got very splotchy, so I didn't really love that either. What I settled on was applying this Pro Acryl turquoise color to the inner half of the wing segments, then using a wet brush to feather that out towards the edges. Then I did a second pass of this, but with a thinned down dark jade color. Where I was blending this out with a damp brush towards the end of the wings, I intentionally made it a lot more watery and kept a lot more water than I usually would on the sort of clean, damp brush that I was blending it out with, so that it kind of turns the paint in those areas into more of a wash where it flows into the recesses a bit more, and that sort of accentuates all that nice sculpted wing texture a bit. When that was dry, I just went back for an edge highlight with a sort of white blue to pure white mix, doing 1 or 2 pretty simple and fast edge highlights. Back to the organic parts, this time just working on some smaller details. I painted the eyes with a black base coat, and then I just dotted 1 little white dot in the corner of each of them as a specular highlight. The stingers and mandibles and things that I painted black got highlighted with grays and then with pure white as well to make them look nice and shiny. The carapace I highlighted with a mix of orange and pale yellow, and sometimes I made this mix a little bit brighter or darker depending on if I was highlighting the red parts or the more orangey yellowish parts. Generally, I tried to keep this highlight a little bit thin and kept it mostly restricted to edge highlights though. And I did a second pass of highlights on all this orange, just really punching up the edge highlights to imply shininess, using pure pale yellow. In retrospect, if you wanted to save time, you could, of course, dry brush these minis to highlight them instead of, painting on edge highlight layers by brush. But I would recommend doing this dry brushing right after painting the bodies orange, but before painting any other parts of the mini, so that it's a lot easier to clean up and hide all of that overspill that'll happen from dry brushing. And as is kind of usual for my style of painting, I push all of my highlights like pretty insanely bright, and I keep them really chunky, and I don't really care that much about smooth blends. If anything, at first I thought I might have made these highlights a little bit too intense, but I do really want to push the shiny carapace look, and after I put these finished models on the table, I was like, okay, no, this does work. I like this. And while I'm noting some minor details, I did notice that the Nuclear Sunrise speed paint from Army Painter does seem to be a little bit grainy, and it leaves some of these like dark orange grains sometimes on the surface of the minis. But honestly, for these bugs, I really kind of dig this look, so I'm not trying to cover that up or hide it or anything. But maybe that's something to keep in mind if you're using this Nuclear Sunrise color for other applications. Then where necessary, I cleaned up any shadows on the carapace with a mix of this sanguine base color and a little bit of black mixed in if needed. And I don't feel like this part is required at all, but I also decided to make the underside of the sort of stinger belly area of these Vespid a sort of pinkish fleshy color. I started by just mixing a, medium color desaturated reddish pinkish brown color, and then just did several steps of highlights up to a very pale flesh color. Nothing fancy at all, mostly just placing these highlights further and further up this sort of, whatever you call these striation type flesh things. Jumping back to the last unpainted bits of the guns and armor, I quickly painted all of the green crystals, just getting the inner crevices of the crystals a light green or whitish color, and making the outer bits a darker, more saturated sort of true green tone. I used these same colors to paint the lenses on the drone and the sniper scope, with the addition of a little white dot in the corner as a specular highlight, which helps to imply reflectiveness on the surface. Then to add some fun object source lighting to the green crystals, I busted out my airbrush, and I airbrushed a mix of fluorescent green and fluorescent yellow, thinned down so that it's not too overpowering. I think that making the crystals glow is totally optional, but I like it as a fun extra detail. Then it's on to the base. I tried to make it match my Volcus terrain decently well, but I won't bother covering this in detail. I just painted an olive green to stone gray gradient on the rubble, then put a dark gray color on the ground, and after that I did a bit of varied dry brushing and shading with greens and browns. Honestly, nothing too extraordinary or notable. I base coated the metals with a silver color, and then applied a whole bunch of rust effect paints all over them. And with that, these painted Vespid are ready to zoom around a battlefield and get blasted out of the air. I started out not being too sold on this team, but I ended up really loving the result. Honestly, I also think there's something to be said for just defaulting to painting the box art colors if you don't have anything else, more specific in mind. I especially love that Kill Team gives you a chance to make color scheme decisions like this without committing to painting a whole army in these colors. And I get a chance to paint and play with some cool Tau bugs without having to commit to buying a whole big Tau army to play in 40k proper or anything like that. And as always, let me know if you have any questions on things I didn't cover in the video, and I'll do my best to answer them. And I don't currently make any money off my videos, and I don't care at all about analytics, but if you give the video a like, or subscribe, or leave a nice comment or something, give me some warm, fuzzy feelings, so do it if you want to, or don't, I guess. It's totally up to you. Take care of yourself, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.